She was doing it to provoke him, and it was working. The Duke of Irongate stood at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of untouched champagne going warm in his hand, and watched Miss Seraphine Vaux smile slowly, deliberately, unmistakably, across the whole glittering length of the room at Lord Ashcombe, who was the one man in England Callum, Duke of Irongate, could not abide, and he understood with perfect clarity that the smile was aimed at himself. They had been sparring for a fortnight. It had begun at a dinner where she had contradicted him on a point of estate law correctly, which was worse, and had refused to yield the field even when he lowered his voice to the register that silenced most people, and had in fact laughed at him, a bright unafraid laugh, and said, "You cannot frown a fact out of existence, your grace, however grand the frown." He had been furious. He had also, he was obscurely aware, not enjoyed an evening so much in years. Since then it had escalated. She sat where he did not wish her to sit, and said what he did not wish her to say, and looked at him, always, with a maddening spark of challenge, as though the great and dreaded Duke of Irongate were a locked door she had wagered a friend she could open. He had never met a woman less impressed by him. He had certainly never met one who smiled at Lord Ashcombe on purpose to see him grind his teeth. She smiled again. Ashcombe, a vain fair fool who mistook the smile for his own conquest, began to make his way across the floor toward her. The Duke set down his warm champagne. He knew what she was doing. That was the intolerable part. She knew that he knew, and she was doing it anyway, and the spark in her eye said plainly, "Well, your grace, what will you do about it?" She had built the whole thing, the smile, the fool crossing the floor, the eyes of half the ballroom now beginning to turn as a deliberate trap, a dare, a lit fuse laid at his feet to see whether the man they all called cold enough to freeze the Thames had any fire in him at all. He had a great deal of fire in him. He had spent a long time learning not to show it. He crossed the room. He did not hurry, which cost him something. He came through the dancers and past the dowagers and the whole bright watching crowd at his own unhurried pace, and he reached her precisely as Lord Ashcombe did, so that the two men arrived at Miss Vaux from opposite sides at the same instant, and the entire ballroom, which had been pretending not to watch, gave up all pretense. "Miss Vaux," said Ashcombe, bowing, "I believe this next is promised." "It is not," said the Duke of Irongate. He did not look at Ashcombe. He looked at her, at Seraphine Vaux in her deep blue gown with the spark of triumph in her eyes because she had made him move. She had proved her wager. She had opened the locked door. And he took her hand, not roughly, but with an absolute finality that brooked no discussion, and he said low, so that only she and the mortified Ashcombe could hear it, "No more of that." The spark in her eyes flared brighter. "No more of what, your grace?" "You know precisely what. You have smiled at that man 3 times this evening, and each time you have looked at me to be sure I saw it, and I saw it, and I am done watching it." He drew her hand through his arm, closing the matter. "You will dance this with me, and the next, and you will stop using that fool to light a fire under a man who has been perfectly well alight this entire fortnight and has only been too proud to say so." For once, for the first time in 2 weeks, Seraphine Vaux had nothing to say. Lord Ashcombe, redundant and ridiculous, retreated. The Duke of Irongate led Miss Vaux onto the floor, where the musicians, sensing drama, struck up something slow. He set his hand at her waist. She set hers on his shoulder, and they danced, the two of them, in a silence that was louder than any words in the room. "You are very sure of yourself," she said at last, when she had recovered her tongue. "I am not sure of myself at all," said the Duke. "I have not been sure of myself since the night you told me I could not frown a fact out of existence. It has been extremely inconvenient. I am, however, entirely sure of you, which is a different thing and easier." "You presume a great deal." "I presume," he said, turning her under his arm, "that a woman does not spend a fortnight sharpening her wit on a man she means to ignore. I presume that she does not smile at his enemy across a ballroom unless she wishes very much for that man to cross the room and stop her. And I presume," his hand tightened the smallest degree at her waist, "that she is smiling now, Miss Vaux, because I did." She was smiling. She stopped, and the stopping of it was its own confession. "You are insufferable," she said. "I am reliably informed of it. You are the first person to say so to my face, which is one of the several reasons I intend to marry you." The dance turned. Her step faltered just once, and he caught her easily, and she recovered and looked up at him with the spark gone strange and uncertain in her eyes, the challenge suddenly out of its depth. "You cannot say such things in a ballroom," she said. "You lit a fuse in a ballroom to make me say them. I am only obliging you." He slowed their steps. "Shall I tell you the truth of it? You frightened me. I am a man everyone else is frightened of, and I have found it restful, and then you arrived and were not frightened in the least, and contradicted me, and laughed at me, and I discovered I had spent years being cold because no one had ever been warm enough to be worth the risk of thawing. You are worth the risk. You have been worth it since the fact I could not frown away. I have simply been, as I said, too proud to cross the room. Tonight you made me. I find I am grateful." She was quiet a long moment. The music wound down around them. "I wagered my cousin," she admitted low, "that I could make the Iron Duke lose his composure before the season was out. I did not think," she stopped. "I did not think I would mind whether I won." "Did you win?" "I do not know," she said. "You crossed the room, but you did not lose your composure. You are maddeningly composed. You have just proposed marriage in the middle of a quadrille without so much as raising your voice." "Then let us call it a draw," said the Duke of Irongate, "and settle the rematch over a lifetime." The music ended. They stood a moment too long on the floor, hand in hand, and the whole ballroom saw it. And by morning the whole town knew that the cold Duke of Irongate had crossed a crowded room to claim spirited Seraphine Vaux from under the nose of his own rival, and that she had let him, which surprised no one who had watched the fortnight of sparring and everyone who had wagered against it. He called the next day. He had never in his life called on a woman the morning after a ball. It was not a thing the Iron Duke did, and his housekeeper, when he asked for his hat at an unheard-of hour, looked at him as though the sky had cracked. He went anyway. He found Miss Vaux in her aunt's morning room, and she received him with a raised brow and a book held pointedly open, as though he had interrupted something of great importance, and he understood at once that the truce of the ballroom was over and the sparring had resumed, and he was, absurdly, delighted. "Your Grace," she said, not rising, "have you come to forbid me some other harmless pleasure?" "I have come to quarrel with you about the estate law," said the Duke, sitting down uninvited. "I have thought further on the matter of the entailed water meadows, and I find you were wrong." She closed the book. The spark came up in her eyes like a struck flint. "I was not wrong. You have not understood the settlement. If you would trouble to read the clause on the reversion." They quarreled about the entailed water meadows for the better part of an hour, and it was, the Duke thought, the finest hour he had spent in a decade. She was quick and merciless and entirely without deference, and she caught him in an error or two errors, and he found to his own astonishment that he did not mind being caught, that he liked being caught, that there was a pleasure he had never tasted in being met, sharp for sharp, by someone who would not yield him an inch he had not earned. "You are right," he said at last, "about the reversion, and about the tenancy. I concede both." She blinked. "You concede?" "I am not a man who concedes," he said. "I am aware. But you are correct, and I would rather be corrected by you than right by myself, which is a sentence I did not know I was capable of forming until this moment, and which I suspect will govern the remainder of my life." He rose. "May I call again tomorrow and be wrong about something else?" "You may call," she said, and the spark in her eyes had softened into something warmer and far more dangerous to a man's composure. "If you bring a better argument than today's. I will not be courted by a man who cannot hold his own in a debate." "Then I shall study," said the Duke of Irongate gravely, "as I have never studied for anything, and lose to you as often as I can contrive it." It became the shape of them. Two proud, quick, unyielding people who had each spent a life never bending, discovering that they would bend gladly for one another, and only for one another, and that the bending was not weakness but the sweetest strength either had known. He conceded to her, and she to him, and each concession was a gift the other had never before received from anyone, and they hoarded them like treasure. Lord Ashcombe, who had been the fuse, sulked about town for a season, and then married an heiress who did not laugh at anyone, and was, the Duke observed, exactly as dull as he deserved. The Duke of Irongate and Miss Seraphine Vaux were married in the spring. She smiled at no one across the church but him, and he stood at the altar with the ghost of a fire in his eyes that all the county had once sworn he did not possess. And when the parson pronounced them man and wife, the new duchess leaned up and said, so that only he could hear, "I believe I have won our wager after all, your grace. You are not composed in the least." "No," said the Duke of Irongate, who had crossed a room and a season and the whole cold distance of his life to reach her. "No more of that. You have thoroughly undone me, madam, and I intend to remain undone for the rest of my days, provided you never again smile at another man to make me prove it." "I make no promises," said the Duchess of Irongate with the old bright spark, "if it works so very well." And he laughed, the Iron Duke laughed, aloud in a church before all the county, and drew her hand through his arm and kept it there, warm against his side, for the whole long happy remainder of a life that neither of them, before a ballroom and a rival and a smile flung across a crowded room, had ever expected to be warm at all.